The UN, of course, for several days up until this point, has been unable to distribute food due to the security situation. We're hearing now that roughly 20,000 people a day are receiving food assistance from UNRWA. This after 13 days of suspending that effort. And again, we revert back to that number, 80% of 1.5 million people requiring food aid. And the UN is only able to reach 20,000 of them a day after 13 days of being unable to distribute food. In fact, on 6 January, which was yesterday, there was absolutely no distribution of food. That's something we can confirm. In addition, the World Food Program, which of course manages the majority of the food that comes into Gaza, is unable to reach 70% of its stocks that are placed in warehouses throughout the Gaza Strip. All right, moving on really quickly here, I'll give you a few more pieces of information for anyone who's looking to report on this. 3 out of the 56 Palestinian Ministry of Health primary health care clinics are able to operate and function now. And we're talking here about clinics, not hospitals, but these are clinics that are dispersed throughout the Gaza Strip, are able to reach communities and neighborhoods that are unserved by hospitals like Al-Shifa, for example. There is a shortage of fuel, of course, for the generators, and that is perhaps the primary reason why these 53 clinics are unable to function. We're hearing reports that with the 3 that are still functioning, and they're facing a similar situation as with the hospitals in the sense that they only have enough diesel fuel, industrial fuel, to last for 5 more days. Going back to the issue of the school that was bombed earlier, this UNRWA shelter, apparently UNRWA is reporting to us that there are about 23 of them throughout the Gaza Strip, and there are 14,000 people seeking shelter in these shelters now. They too are running low on food stocks. They of course have no access to electricity or heat, and in some cases we're looking at situations where fresh water is also running dangerously low. In addition to that, there's a severe lack of things like blankets, mattresses, coats, and clothing for people who fled their homes in a hurry and don't have a way to protect themselves from what is inevitably the cold weather of January in Gaza. The Gaza power plant, and we can say with some certainty now that more than 800,000 people, by the way, lack access to electricity. I've heard estimates upwards of 1 million people, is nowhere near being able to function at this point. Not only was it bombed, not only does it lack access to the fuel to be able to make it work, but also the power lines that run from the generation plant to the various sort of substations that allow people in refugee camps to have electricity have been damaged. Our understanding at this point is that there are 2 functioning electrical wires or electrical ways to transfer electricity, from the because I'm not an expert on this, but from the generation plant to the substations that are functional, and that the spare parts to be able to make these things work have not been let in over the course of the last 13 days. On 6 January, which of course was yesterday, 215,000 liters of industrial gasoline were transported to Nahal Oz, but did not make it through. To re-operationalize the 1 power generating turbine in Gaza, this is a direct quote from UNRWA, the plant requires a minimum of 300,000 liters. And again, 215,000 were delivered yesterday, but not to the generation plant, simply to Nahal Oz. 300,000 liters are required to make it operational again, the equivalent of 6 trucks, and those 300,000 liters would produce 1/4 of Gaza City's energy needs for a period of 2 days. Not the entire Gaza Strip, Gaza City's energy needs. Again, 300,000 liters are needed to power 1/4 of Gaza City's energy needs for a period of 2 days. That's the latest from the ground in terms of UNRWA. Now, the humanitarian corridor that we heard about yesterday, and I actually heard about as I was sitting in a chair waiting to be interviewed by somebody on Al Jazeera English. He literally got the wire as I was sitting there. And he asked me a question, giving me absolutely no time to think about it. What do you think about this humanitarian corridor? We don't know what's happened today, but I can tell you that based on the facts that we received yesterday from the Israelis, we're talking about 3 hours a day for a limited amount of supplies to be defined by the Israelis. And our understanding is from people is anyone here from the State Department, by the way? Okay, perhaps you could verify this or tell me that I'm wrong. But my understanding is that the spare parts that are needed to go into Gaza to make the power generation plant functional, to fix any number of buildings, clinics, hospitals, schools that have been damaged are not being allowed into Gaza. Is that true?
I actually haven't heard anything about spare parts.
Okay.
Specifically.
That's my understanding as well. And frankly, it reminds me of the horrific situation in Iraq during 13 years of sanctions. I remember at the time that things like lead pencils, this was a sort of the famous example, were not allowed into Iraq because they represented a dual-use item because they had lead in them. So, am I inclined to take the Israelis at their word that this represents a humanitarian corridor? No, I'm not. And even if I did, if this were a humanitarian corridor, what we are asking for today as an organization that represents the humanitarian interests of the Palestinian people, what the Jerusalem Fund, I imagine, would ask the same of, and what everyone in this room should urge all of our policymakers, all of the politicians in this country and beyond to do, is not to open a humanitarian corridor, but to open the Gaza Strip. Let's go back for a moment and remind ourselves that when we hear Israeli spokespeople talk about the lack of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we don't need to even go there, do we? We don't even need to go there. That this humanitarian crisis was at least 18 months in the making. That we saw a situation in Gaza in June of 2007, whereby, according to WHO, WFP, and UN figures, the people of Gaza were receiving all of 10% of the supplies that they had received a year earlier, across the board. Whether we're talking about medication, whether we're talking about spare parts, whether we're talking about fuel or food. For 18 months, the people of Gaza have been subjected to a siege unlike any we have seen since the ghettos of Warsaw. And if anyone is offended by that parallel, then they need only look at the statistics. They need only consider that in the Gaza Strip, as of 8 months ago, there were 11 incubators for prematurely born children, serving 1.5 million people, and 7 of them did not work. And the other 4 worked only when the electricity was on. They need only consider that in a strip of land with 1.5 million people in it, you have nurses and physicians who are using something called an ambu bag, which is a manually operated respirator, to keep people alive for hours and days on end. We have seen stories. We have seen photographs, literally, of this bag, a small bag that contains oxygen in it, and people sitting on top of a patient and pressing it, like this, for hours and days on end, to keep patients alive. This ambu bag was designed to be used in an emergency room for a matter of minutes until a surgeon or a nurse or somebody who's an expert at this can come in and insert an endotracheal tube, right, which can then be connected to an electronic or an automatic respirator and can keep somebody alive. It wasn't intended for the use that it's being used for in Gaza today. When you add to that, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that in the first 2 days of the bombing in Gaza, 100 tons of bombs were dropped, killing anywhere between 300 and 400 people, depending on who you believe. What you have is a situation that, believe it or not, according to a statistic I'm about to cite, is more dramatic, more lethal, more deadly than Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. And here's why. Because our military, like militaries all over the world, has something, a sick notion, called the kill ratio.